Hello and welcome to the monthly Cyril the Wolf music lesson from my studio apartment. No, it's actually just a room in my apartment that I use as a music production room as well as for work. But I wanted to show you something that I've recently been able to actually experiment with because I was able to go to Long Island to visit my perennial drummer Brandon, and I was able to record some live drums. And live drums are very different than approaching studio, like the sample drums that I showed you in the Lapis Lazuli video. If you want to check it out, link will be in the description. There's a lot of work that is involved. I'm going to split this up as much as I can. Right now, these tutorial videos are only once a month. If you want more, check out my Patreon. So let me show you what this sounds like as we have it. So this is just the drums, actually with effects. So check it out real quick here. Now, I did want to be clear that that doesn't include any bussing or anything. That is straightforward, just the tracks. So just want to make sure you know that there's no bussing going on. So you can do this even if you aren't familiar with bussing or how that works. So I'm just going to skip right ahead to the kick drum, and I'm going to remove the effects for now. And I'm just going to show you what the what one track sounds like, because notice I have two kick drums here, one labeled sub kick, one labeled kick. There's a reason for that, and I will tell you why in a moment. So here, listen. This is, again, unaffected kick drum. You can hear that there is a lot of other instruments in there, and toms especially bleed in. As you'll notice, I cut those out already. And you can tell, I mean, the fill doesn't really have any kick drum in it. You can probably just go and manually cut it out. That's completely fine. That is really legit editing. Don't worry about heavily needing to carve things up for rock and roll, like modern rock production styles. Certain things like maybe some jazz or whatever you don't want to do too much editing in, maybe. But again, I'm just going to give you advice on what I'm familiar with. I'm not going to make too much conjecture. So I'm going to show you the affected version here. Just the kick drum here. I added the extra click now. All right, great. So it's important for you to listen to that and hear what the differences is. Why do I have two drum kicks? Well, obviously one has a lot of the thump and the low end to it, whereas the other one has just the click, the beater, the hit of the drum, the transients, the high end that makes it cut through a mix. There's a reason I did that, and I'll explain it to you very quick momentarily. Let's start with what processing I applied to the kick drum. And I will start with first the gate that I applied to it. For, again, the low end, not the click. I'll explain the click in a little bit, but I want to go over what a gate does, because I've never explained a noise gate before. And basically, where anything below a certain decibel level, in this case it says negative 23.4. Again, this is right on the snare, but whatever it is, and I'll show you how that works in a moment. So you say anything below that and it stops it. Now, there's other settings, of course. There's pre-open, which literally the program itself will look ahead a little bit and see what's coming up and see if it needs to open up. And it will open slightly before, however long you say it. You can even do some interesting, like, reversey sounding effects using high pre-opens. But that's that. Generally, don't need to use that. There are some occasions, but for drums, I don't really use it. Attack is how quickly it opens, how quickly the gate opens, and for a drums, you want this pretty quick. 3 milliseconds sounds big, especially when you're looking at it like this. It's really not. If you have 0, it sounds fakey. It sounds like a very digital attack. And I seldom go 0, but I usually use a 1. Hold is how long the gate stays open before it hits the release. So in this case, I have 11 milliseconds for this snare because I want it to ring a little bit. And then the release is if there's no other inputs, it'll shut. And so in this case, the release I have is 100 because I just want, again, the little bit of ring there. And this is for the snare. I'll show you the snare in a moment, but this is just some settings for the snare. Let's skip over to the settings that I have on the kick drum click. See, I don't need to have any resonance with this kick drum because it should just be the click of the kick. So if you want something to feel like it has more low end, you can't use a heavy gate on it. So for that reason, I've split it up, because if I split up the higher end of the transient, and again, it's an exact clone of the track, there's no additional phasey or delays or anything else like that, I can have a 1 millisecond attack, no open, no hold, and a very, very short release time. So that way, all I get is that, the click of the kick. And I'll show you kind of what that sounds like real quick. See, by itself, that sounds super lame. But when you have both of them going, it sounds, really cohesive. That's an important thing, especially for rock music. Now, you don't always need to do that, but I like to have a clicky kick for most metal and rock music. So it's a good technique to know. If you're following me, you probably enjoy that type of music. So it's a good technique to have. And you don't need as much as you think, but it's there. So let's move along to some of the other settings that I have going for this compressor. This side chain, you don't want to even worry about that. This might as well not exist. I've never gotten it to work with this particular compressor, so don't worry about it. Attack is how quickly the compressor comes into focus. The compressor on the high click I have really low. I have it like 30 milliseconds, not too fast because we already have the gate doing some work really. And so this will compress the sound really quickly. And so I might up the kick a little bit more because I don't want very much variation in just the beater. So, but for the low end, I need it to be a little bit slower so that gives it enough time to really hit and have that thump before the compressor comes in and reduces the volume of it. Now, right now, this has a highest ratio of 4.68 decibels to 1. So every decibel it goes up above, I guess in this case, 0 for this compressor, it will reduce it by 5 decibels. So that really helps even out the low end. You really, really want an even low end because you can get the sense of an extra hit with the higher end. So that's why you want to make sure that. And I have a slow release time in this case because I feel like when you want the boom, you want more of that thump out. So it's almost a second long. Realistically, though, you can have a shorter release time depending on how fast your kick lines are. As far as the input drive goes, that really just depends on the compressor you have. Some compressors you'll be able to set where the threshold is, aka like the gate was, where anything below a certain frequency it starts acting. But in this case, this doesn't. It has a set, I think it's a -10, so you drive it more, and that's how you get more compression. So you can see that I have the gain reduction going to about 3K on average, probably for the lighter hits, 3 decibels, excuse me. That's probably a good way. But again, the noise gates are important because, as you heard before, you get a lot of stuff. So what's the other reason that I have it split up? Well, that's because if I applied this EQ that you're seeing right now, which is on the click, to the normal drum kit and tried to get it to handle everything, in order to get the amount of carry I want in the low end, I would have to reduce the gate. And when I reduce the gate, this EQ produces some problems because you hear a lot more of the cymbals. And during what would be the chorus line, see, that's what you get. And then if you take the plugin, bring that up, see, you can see that if I reduce this to where it would actually carry, you end up with all this artifice. Yeah, see, any bleed just gets expounded upon when you have you know, when you have the kick set that way. So, whereas with this, sure, it's there, but it's so muted and low because of the EQ settings, where, as you can tell, are kind of inverse of the other one, that you get more of the thump, and you don't have to worry about that bleeding into the rest of the drum kit. So you get that thing. And I have to reset this to, there we go, proper levels so that you're getting the click and everything else like I wanted. But so that's the big things. Those are the things you need to pay attention to. Now for the equalizer, every kick drum is different. Every recording is different. You can do frequency sweeps, which I'll talk about in a second, but you basically want to destroy everything below 250 for the click. And generally the click of this drum is around, in my experience anyway, about 2000 hertz. And then if you want a little bit more of a really the high end click, then you can go to 5K. Anything above that isn't really necessary in my experience, but at least for kick drum. And then for the low end, you really can work with around 80 hertz. Don't boost it too much because you don't want it to compete too much with the bass. And be careful, because what can happen with the low end is, see, that's what you get a lot of, but if you cut it, you get more of a nice, tight sounding kick drum. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. And don't be afraid to be too extreme with the EQs, especially if you start layering like I have, because more like when you get more extreme with the EQ, at least you can kind of understand what you're going for, and it makes an overall tighter product. All right, last thing. So as we talked about, here we have a snare drum, and this is just the snare drum mic. One thing you have to be concerned about with the snare drum, and this is where I'm going to bring the overheads in. The overheads get a lot of snare, as does every other part of the drum kit. So you really want to be careful if you're doing any editing on the snare or anything else, that it needs to line up with the overheads, etc. So the snare drum is a little difficult. Now, the other thing I want you to notice is the difference between the snare drum as we have it here. Now, what do you hear there? There's this kind of low high end ring that you still get a lot of if I keep the gate going without the EQ. So I want to show you this EQ for a second here. See, that's a much tighter snare drum. And why? Well, we have what we call frequency. I've carved specific frequencies out of this. So this is frequency carving. And one way to find what frequency that rings at is you take a really short band EQ and you sweep it around. So if you think that's a particularly nasty spot, just cut it. So, that's how you do that. I determined with this snare drum using that technique where you raise it up, you can hear where the resonance is happening. And again, really tight Q, so really high Q, and you just boost it and you can figure out where that nastiness is happening. Once you figure out where the nastiness is happening, you just cut that a little bit. And corrective EQing is not something I would recommend all the time for everything, but it's really, really awesome for making sure that your drum sounds are clean. And if, like, for instance, your hi-hat is coming through a little bit too much, you can find where the hi-hat's main tone is and it right down. So that way, if you boost the snare, you're not unintentionally boosting the hi-hat. It goes back to real quick why I did that with the kick, because even if I tried to kind of frequency cut, it would be cutting the frequency I want for the click on the kick. So I had to make sure that the click on the kick had its own tighter noise gate to prevent it from having any extra stuff. As far as the noise gate goes, I did show you that already, and I will try to show you that again here. Well, it was the same. You go back, but there we go. So you have a fairly open thing because you don't want it to be too crazy. Because if you have it too crazy with the snare, well, here, I'll show you. You end up with that. And that doesn't sound terribly musical. So you kind of want it to have some room to breathe. And that's the big difference. So, and that's really the biggest EQ I do. I do have this guy, which is somewhat of a compressor, a little bit of a compressor. And I do boost around 3K for some more snap on my snare drums. So that's about it. Other than, before I let you go, I want to show you that there is an EQ on the snare drum, which is basically just drop that low end at about 100 hertz. Don't really need anything below that on a snare drum. And it helps the kick drum, any bleed from the kick drum, go away. So that's just kick and snare. And just how to make kick and snare get isolated enough so you can work with them in the mix. And again, different styles call for different things. Listen, use your ears when you're listening to the whole drum kit, and make sure that it sounds like a rock drum beat to you. Because if it doesn't sound live enough, then you can always let the noise gates bleed a little bit more. I prefer to have a really tight recording, which is a tight sounding drum kit, which is why I'm doing what I'm doing. Thanks all for listening this month, and I hope to see you next month for more music and lessons from Cyril. Have a good one.